Welcome to the Plato Paradigm, a paradigm shift in reading Plato's dialogues. Episode 187, IO 538, B to C. Now that IO has agreed that the subject matter of one techne cannot be the subject matter of another techne, it should be easy enough for Socrates to show that rhapsody is not a techne, since all the subject matter of rhapsody is dealt with by other techne, other crafts. This shouldn't take long then, so let's see how Socrates does it. Potron un periton epon hon epes, ete kalos lege homeros et me, su kalion gnose, heiniochos. Heiniochos. So, about the utterances which you uttered, whether Homer speaks finely or not, will you know more finely, or a charioteer? A charioteer. The utterances uttered could also be the words worded. The stem for the verb and the noun is ep, as in epic poetry. Socrates could have used other words for the words you spoke, but he deliberately uses these words, which do connect with epic poetry, which is the sort of poetry with which IO deals. In the translation, I used the translation finely for kalos and more finely for the comparative kalion, but there's more going on here than meets the eye. When Socrates says that Homer speaks finely, the question is whether he speaks finely or not. We are to understand from finely that Socrates is referring to the aesthetic sense, beautifully, because Homer does speak beautifully, but he could also be referring to the practical sense, well, since it is the charioteer who speaks better about charioteering than Homer does. Socrates, however, leaves nothing to chance, and with the comparative kalion, more finely, he forces the issue because he is asking who will know more finely, and you do not know more beautifully, you know more well. And Socrates is asking who knows better, the rhapsode, in other words, IO himself, or a charioteer. And since the comparative of the adverb is being used in the practical sense, not the aesthetic sense, this somewhat forces the issue about kalos lege in the first part. IO will now understand the question definitely in the practical sense. Will you, IO, or a charioteer, know better whether Homer speaks well, not beautifully, well or not, about charioteering? So we see that Socrates has used some sleight of hand here in order to force the issue. Obviously, a charioteer speaks better about charioteering than a poet does, although a poet speaks more beautifully about charioteering than a charioteer does. What is stranger about this question is that Socrates didn't have to ask it at all. All he had to ask was which techne is in charge of charioteering. This is indeed the point of the next few lines. Rhapsodos garpu aluch heiniochos. Nay, for you, I suppose, are a rhapsode, and not a charioteer. Yes. hede rhapsodice techne heteres dites henioches. Nay, but the rhapsodic techne is other than the charioteering techne. Yes. Eiara hetera, peri heteron ca episteme pragmaton estin. Nay. If it is other, then the episteme as well is about other things, pragmata. Yes. Let's look at the progression of this argument. The charioteer will know better than the rhapsode whether Homer is speaking well or not about charioteering, and then Io is a rhapsode and not a charioteer, and then the rhapsodic techne is other than charioteering techne, and then the episteme of the two technae is of different things, pragmata. They have different subject matter. We might well ask if the subject matter of the charioteering techne is charioteering, and it is for this reason that the charioteer will know better than the rhapsode whether Homer is speaking well about charioteering. How come Homer is speaking about charioteering at all? Well, we've seen earlier in the dialogue when Io and Socrates were talking about other poets, it was determined that the people who knew whether a poet talked well were necessarily people who also knew the techne which the poet had. And it was determined then that people without a techne can actually talk about the subject matter of a techne, but would talk about it badly. And this seems to be the argument here as well, because the charioteer has the techne of charioteering. Homer necessarily doesn't have the techne of charioteering, and therefore when he talks about charioteering, he talks badly about it. But only someone with the techne of charioteering would know that Homer is talking badly about it. It is assumed here that only the technetes will have the appropriate episteme, and the possibility is not even considered that someone might have the episteme without actually applying it. Someone could have an understanding of charioteering without actually being a charioteer. A technetes, the craftsman, has the episteme and applies it. And it is Io's fault that the possibility is not considered that Homer has the episteme of charioteering without actually being a charioteer, without actually applying the knowledge in driving a chariot. We should also ask ourselves just how much subject matter we require in order to be considered having a modicum of techne. Is knowing 5 fingers on a hand enough to have the arithmeticae techne? If it is, then knowing roughly how to drive around a corner on a chariot should be enough to give Homer the credit that he might have some parts, at least, of the charioteering techne. Strangest of all in this argument, after everything Socrates has said and everything that Io has agreed to, Socrates does not conclude that the rhapsodist has no techne. Instead, he carries on with yet another example. Tidede, hotan Homeros lege hos tetromenoto machaoni, hecamede he nestoros palake, kukeona pinen didosi. What then, when Homer says that Hecamede, the girl of Nestor, gives to drink a potion to the wounded Machaon? This occurs in Iliad Book 11, which is just before the middle of the Iliad. And now Socrates is going to quote 2 lines. And as Io did, he will insert Phesi into the first line, thus breaking the meter. Phesi is he says, Homer says. Kai legepos hutos, oino pramneo phesin, epidaigeion kneturon, knestig chalkei paradekromuon potopson. And he says something like this. Over Pramnian wine, he says, she grated goat cheese with a bronze grater, and by the side of the drink, an onion as a side dish. The bit about the onion actually comes a little earlier in this section in the received text of Homer. In our version, the second line reads, Kniste chalkeye epid alfita liuka palune, with a bronze grater, and she sprinkled on it white barley. After the quote, Socrates asks, Taute ete orthos lege Homeros ete me, Potron iatrikes esti diagonai kalos e rhapsodikes. Iatrikes. Whether Homer says these things correctly or not, is it the task of the physician's techne or of the rhapsode's techne to discern kalos finely, well, of the physician's techne? From Io's response, it would seem that he has no problem with the version Socrates cites, and this gives us a problem. Is this intended to be a correct quote? In which case we see that Socrates is just as good as a rhapsode when it comes to remembering lines, or is it intended to be a misquote, in which case are we to suspect that Io is not so good as he claims to be when it comes to knowing everything about Homer, given that he doesn't point out Socrates' mistake? Whatever the case may be, we find that Socrates once again doesn't come to the point. He doesn't say, and therefore Rhapsody isn't a techne. What is he waiting for?